Are you depressed, or do you just have a horrible life? And those are not the same question, because if you're depressed, you have a life that in principle should work, but isn't. And so you come and say, look, I've got a lot of things going for me. You know, I've got a good job, I've got a good family, my wife loves me, but man, I'm miserable all the time. It's like, okay, well, let's delve into that a bit more deeply. But that kind of sounds like depression. But then you might come and say, well, I'm miserable, I'm suffering, I don't even want to be alive. And then I might ask, well, do you have an intimate partner? Well, no, not really. And I have had a history of catastrophic relationships. Do you have any friends? Well, you know, I have this one person I phone like once every month or so. But other than that, no, I don't really see anyone. Well, do you have any close family? No, my family's pretty fractured. I don't get along with my mom and dad. I don't see my sisters or my siblings much. It's like, well, how about a job? Or how about a career, or failing that, a job? It's like, well, I've always kind of been underemployed, and I just lost my job, and you know, that's not going very well, and so on. You can walk through someone's life, and you can find out if they're reasonably embedded in a hierarchy of social institutions. And if the answer is no, no intimate partner, no family, no children, no friends, no job, no career, no educational pathway, no engagement in civic responsibility, let's say, no church attendance, no spiritual life, no routine. It's like, well, you're not depressed, you just have a horrible life, multidimensionally. Like, it's no wonder you're depressed. There's nothing in your life that is working. But it's interesting, because that's not exactly a diagnosis at the level of the individual. It's a diagnosis in relationship to the relationship between the individual and this structure of containing social institutions. If you don't have an intimate partner, and you don't have a family, and you don't have any friends, and you don't have a career or a job or any civic involvement, or any involvement, let's say, with religious institutions, and you don't have any creative striving, all you've got left is pain. And so that's what you have. And so here's a different way of thinking about sanity. Sanity isn't being well constituted as an atomized individual. Sanity is what makes itself manifest if you're properly situated in a hierarchy of social order. To be well constituted, you have to be a harmonious player in a multidimensional symphony, in some real sense, of social interaction. It's very hard to stay on the straight and narrow without a partner who doesn't share your blind spots, correcting you constantly. You know, now that's annoying. There's a tussling about it, right? There's a fractious and adversarial element to that, because if you're married, you don't see eye to eye, and thank God for that, because sometimes in your foolish insistence on being right, you're wrong, and wrong in a way that'll take you out. And so you better have a partner who doesn't think the same way you do. And fortunately, if you have a partner, you have a partner who doesn't think the same way you do. And so if you can get the dialogue flowing, then that's a mutually corrective mechanism. And so then you might say, well, the truthful dialogue between partners in a marriage is actually, it's the process by which sanity itself is generated. And I mean technically, it's like you're too complex to regulate yourself, period. And so you need other people to help you do that. So if you have a wife or a husband, someone who knows you and is there for the long run, they can help, you can help each other find the meaningful path and stay on it. And you can't do that alone. And probably just having a partner isn't enough. You need kids, likely, to keep you sane or to drive you crazy, depending on the nature of your children, let's say. You need family, you need your parents, you need your siblings, you need another community around you that's not merely your wife, because you're so crazy that it takes a village to keep you sane. And so, and then surrounding that more intimate web of kinship, you need friends. And friends keep you sane. Well, how? Well, you have to act in a manner that makes them want to be around you to have friends. And that means that to maintain your friendships, you have to be saner than you really are, right? They have to be able to enjoy their time with you. If you practice forthright and voluntary exposure to that which terrifies and dismays you, it transforms you. And we really know this as psychologists. We even know there's more and more evidence suggesting, for example, that if you imagine you adopt this attitude of voluntary confrontation, that changes you psychophysiologically. So much of the biochemistry of motivation and emotion is transformed when you take a stressor which could be oppressive and paralyze you and cause you to withdraw, and you reverse that and you decide to advance. It's like a different spirit inhabits you. And I mean this physiologically. There's a whole different pattern of being that makes itself manifest in you neurologically and psychophysiologically and pharmacologically. So you take it on as a challenge, right? And that transforms you at a cellular level too, because one of the things we've discovered in recent years is that if you do something new and complex, then that turns on that parts of your DNA that haven't produced proteins before will start producing new proteins and reconstruct you from the cellular level up. So it's a deep transformation, and we have no idea how deep. And again, you could ask yourself, if you didn't withdraw in fear from anything from everything that life threw at you, who could you become? And I would say that's the central religious question in some real deep sense. You know, are more things thrown at us than we can manage? Well, that's a tricky question, because pretty dreadful things are thrown our way. And you might say, well, that just presents an insuperable barrier to progress. That's not very helpful, because you're alive, here you are, you've got these problems to contend with, and if it's an impossible task, then how could you be anything but hopeless and desperate? But then you think, well, wait a second. How would things transform if I took this on as a voluntary adventure, you know, regardless of its scope? And the scope would include unjust suffering, death, and hell. And that's not just some religious or metaphysical vision. It's like, no, you're actually going to have to contend with that in your life, in whatever way those things make themselves manifest to you personally. That's coming, man. And so maybe you better get prepared. And then the question might be, well, what would happen if you got prepared? And the answer might be, you'd be prepared. And I think the religious enterprise, in its deepest sense, is that process of preparation. And, you know, you might want to even push that a bit farther. You might say, well, not only do you want to get prepared for what's coming your way, but you want to be so prepared that when it comes your way, that it doesn't make you bitter and resentful and tempted by the desire to walk the path that would make all of that even worse. And so you might say, well, if you could really face up to what you need to face up to, not only could you turn yourself into someone that could bear the catastrophe of life and exposure to hell, but maybe you could turn yourself into someone who would still do good even while facing those things. Now, that's a pretty noble goal.
What would you estimate are the boundaries between self-care and selfishness?
Well, that's a good follow-up question for what we've been just discussing. Well, the first thing we have to sort out there is, well, what do you mean by self? And people make memes about me because I'm always asking for word definitions. But and it annoys people because they think, well, it's just, you know what that means. It's like, is God real? What do you mean by real? Well, you can't ask that. It's like, well, then you can't ask your question either. What do you mean real? Well, everyone understands that. It's like, really, we do we? We understand what's real. We've got that nailed down. What you're really asking is something like, here's what I am insisting that you regard as real, which is usually something like an objective materialism. Does God fit into that category? It's like, well, that's a completely different question than the one you asked. No, perhaps, is the answer to that question, but you didn't formulate the question reasonably, because when you formulate a question like, is God real? God's a mystery in that question, and so is real. And you don't get away with the axiomatic presupposition that you've got real nailed down, and all we have to do now is mop up God. It's not reasonable. It's not acceptable in the least. It's just a trick, and it's not a very sophisticated trick. And so in this situation, selfishness versus self-care, well, I think really the issue there is the definition of self. So whatever the self is very complicated, because it's really what you are at your core. That's the question. That's unbelievably complicated. It's like, what the hell do you know about who you are at your core? I mean, human beings we have no idea what we are in the final analysis. And so Carl Jung wrote books on the self. He believed Christ was a symbol of the self. It's a very complicated idea. It takes a lot of unpacking. You could think about the self as what it is that has demands right now. And when people attempt to define themselves subjectively, which has become something to be insisted upon in our current culture, they usually mean something like, the ultimate self is the whim that possesses me now. And that's a dubious proposition. What the whim that possesses you now is more accurately conceptualized as a fragmentary self. You know, if you have a 2-year-old and the 2-year-old wants something and has a little tantrum in the grocery store because of it, the impulsive demand that possesses that child in that context is a fragmentary part of the child, but it in no means is reflective of the totality of that person. And then you might ask yourself, well, what's the totality? And well, as I said, that's a very complicated problem, but the totality of a person is certainly their iterations across time. It's at least that, right? Because there's a past you, and there's a present you, and there's a future you, and whatever you is in the final analysis is the aggregation of all of that across time. And maybe the aggregation of all of your manifestations in every social context as well. And then I could say, well, if you're taking care of yourself wisely, then you're taking all of that into account simultaneously. And then if that's selfishness, then that could be viewed as a positive good. But if you're subordinating that greater totality to the impulses of a momentary whim, which you've defined as the self, then that's a very bad idea. All that's going to do is cause trouble and make you unpopular. And so I don't believe there's any difference between service to the highest self and service to other people. I think those are the same thing. And we can think about that technically too. So there's a lot of other people and there's only one of you. And you're going to interact with people in a multitude of ways across your life. And you could imagine this, is that if you play fair in every interaction, or if everyone you interact with walks away from your interactions having gained, then everyone is going to line up to play with you. And so how is that going to be anything but good for you? How could anything possibly be better than that? Because you're outnumbered very badly. And so if all the people around you are inclined because of the way you've conducted yourself to facilitate your progress forward, why wouldn't that be the best thing for you that could possibly occur? And one of the things I've suggested to my audiences, and people seem to resonate with this quite deeply, is imagine yourself ill and bereft of capacity, suffering. You think, well, what might sustain you during such a time? This is the question that's posed in a marriage, for example, for better or for worse, let's say. And one answer is the fruits of the sacrifices that you offered in relationship to other people previously. And so what does that mean? Well, if you had been responsible and caring, mature, and self-sacrificing in the proper manner, and I don't mean martyrdom, like a nihilistic martyrdom or a resentful martyrdom, then you've stored up, to put it sort of coldly, social capital. And then people will be pleased to return the favor in times of desperation. And that way, if that was the case for all of us all of the time, then we'd be in a mutually sustaining web of interactions. And that's not exactly organizing your psyche, right, so that you can sail through suffering. It's more external. It's that you're storing up your sanity in the reciprocal goodwill that you've built up with other people. And to do that optimally, you do that in a spirit of something like playful love, if you do it optimally. And of course that's going to redound to your great benefit. But even better than that, it's going to redound to your great benefit in a way that's also simultaneously mutually beneficial to as many others as you're skillful enough to manage. This developmental psychologist named Jean Piaget. Piaget is a very interesting thinker. And he was motivated by, his life's goal was to reconcile science and religion. And modern analysts of Piaget generally regard him as a developmental psychologist. But he described himself as a genetic epistemologist. And by genetic, he meant one who analyzes the genesis of things or their beginning. And by epistemologist, he meant someone who analyzes structures of knowledge. And so what Piaget was trying to do was to understand how our structures of knowledge developed across time. He thought if you wanted to pursue philosophy, and even more deeply, let's say theology, then it would make sense to look at how knowledge structures develop from childhood forward, because they're simpler in childhood and you might be able to understand them better than having to dive right into adult cognition. And he got a long ways on his enterprise. I think farther than people realize. He's a very sophisticated thinker. And he had this theory of equilibration, which is a lovely theory. So an equilibrated system will maintain itself without outside compulsion. And you might think, well, that's what you want in a political system, right? Because you want to live in a state that you want to live in. And you all, in fact, live in a state, I don't mean California, I mean the United States. And California less so lately, by the way. You want to live in a state where you don't have to be compelled. You want to be part of an organization that you've bought into voluntarily. And it's so interesting, because that's actually one of the criteria by which you could judge the value of a state. Does the state have to impose its dictates by force? Or does the state offer you a vision that you voluntarily accept and celebrate? And I would say your country has been very, very good at that. I mean, the American dream is not a dream that merely possesses Americans. Right? It's a dream that, in some sense, has been offered to the whole world. And I would say, you might ask, well, what's the evidence for that? And I would say, how about the fact that people want to move here? That constitutes the evidence. And even though this country is far from perfect, that's not exactly the issue. The issue is it less imperfect than the other offerings? And the answer to that is, well, do people want to move here? And if the answer to that is yes, then
that's the evidence. And clearly they want to move here, and there are reasons for that. And so, and the reason for that in some sense is because you're playing an equilibrated game. It's a game that will sustain itself without compulsion. And that's actually the definition of a game. So for Piaget, a game was a microcosm of the promised land. That's a good way of thinking about it, if you want to think about it theologically. So a game is an arrangement of vision shared by two or more players voluntarily. And so when two children decide to play a game together, maybe they decide to play house, the one child who's offering the game might say, do you want to play house? And the other child, say it's a boy and a girl, will say, yeah, I'd like to play house with you. And so then no force is required because both are voluntary participants. And then the children develop a shared vision, which is the confines of the game, to play house. And then they run the simulation. And if they run the simulation properly, then they both find it engaging. And the engagement is a marker for the quality of the game. And the game expands their capacity to perceive and act with skill in relationship to an important life goal, right? Establishing a permanent relationship, because that's what you're practicing when you're playing house. And if that's done optimally, then it doesn't require compulsion. And if the two children are very good at doing that together, then they want to repeat it and continue to develop their skill, and that's what a friendship is. And that's not based on power, right? That's not based on a power relationship. That's so cool to know that, because, you know, the cynics say, well, it's all about power, and they usually say that because they want it to be all about power. But really, but that isn't the basis for stable human relations. Stable human relations are based on the construction of equilibrated states. And if your marriage is equilibrated, you both want to be in it. Now, I mean, there'll be times when you don't, and you know, you need to abide by the fact that you've accepted some constraints so that, well, you're not equilibrated, you're not getting along, you don't just leave, right? You still fight it through and try to reestablish an equilibrated state. But the idea of equilibrated state is extraordinarily interesting, and it's a vision of paradise. And the proper vision of paradise is something like eternal play. That's a good way of thinking about it. And play is a better basis for the establishment of social relations than power by any measure, by any multitude of measures. And so, properly selfish is an equilibrated state across multiple instantiations of games across a very long period of time in very many social contexts. And so, if you're serving that, that's enlightened selfishness, you could say. But it's identical with treating other people in the best possible manner. It's the same thing. And we know that, you know, we have an ethos, our culture is predicated on an ethos, which is treat your neighbor as you would like to be treated yourself, or maybe more, love thy neighbor as thyself. And that means to act towards your neighbor as if he or she is capable of producing a sequence of Jacob's ladder-like goals across time, and that you're of the same nature, and that will increase the probability that that direction will be the one that makes itself manifest. And that's definitely the case. I mean, I had people in my clinical practice who had become embittered and resentful. They were often naive people, and people generally start out naive, who'd been betrayed. You know, and they regarded their loss of naivety as an increment in wisdom. And you see this with cynical people, right? And they think, well, I was naive and I got burned, and that's not going to happen again. And it's like, fair enough, that actually is an increment in wisdom, but you're in the desert at that point, right? I mean, the naivety wasn't a virtue, and the collapse is a catastrophe, but the place you end up with is not positive. But you're not going to say, well, I'm not going to drop my cynicism and go back to being naive, because that would actually be a reversal of the acquisition of knowledge. Plus, you know, what they say, once burned, twice shy. So then, well, what's the alternative to the cynicism that's induced by malevolence? And the answer to that is something like, it's something like courageous trust. So imagine that you want to bring the best out of people, even though now you know that there's plenty of the worst there too. And the answer is, well, the question is, how do you do that? And the answer doesn't seem to be by facing everyone with a pervading spirit of distrust and bitterness. That just doesn't seem to work. And you might think, well, that's justified because I've been burned multiple times. Why wouldn't I do that? And the answer has to be something like, because you have the courage not to. Right? If you're not going to fall back into a foolish naivety and not allow yourself to be twisted into nihilism by bitterness, then your option is something like, well, I know perfectly well that you're full of snakes, but I'm going to extend my hand anyway, based on the faith that if you have the courage to do that, that the being that you will call out of the other person is thereby rendered most likely to be of the upward stumbling type. And I think that's the case. You know, you see people who are very sophisticated in their perceptions and social ability, and they can interact even with people who are quite corrupt and still increase the probability quite dramatically that the interaction will be positive. And that's part of that impulse towards the development of an equilibrated state. And so to reach out your hand like that to your fallen brother, let's say, without being naive, that's part and parcel of acting out that highest order conception of the self. That's the logos. That's how that works. So that's an answer to that question.
What I learned to do, I think, was to stop saying things that made me weak. I mean, I'm still trying to do that because I'm always feeling when I talk whether or not the words that I'm saying are either making me align or making me come apart. I think alignment is the right way of conceptualizing it, because I think if you say things that are as true as you can say them, let's say, then they come out of the depths inside of you. Because we don't know where thoughts come from. We don't know how far down into your substructure the thoughts emerge. We don't know what processes of physiological alignment are necessary for you to speak from the core of your being. We don't understand any of that. We don't even conceptualize that, but I believe that you can feel that. I decided that I would start practicing not saying things that would make me weak. And what happened was that I had to stop saying almost everything that I was saying. I would say 95% of it. It's a hell of a shock to wake up and realize that, you know, and you might think, well, do you really want all of that to burn off? It's like, well, there's nothing left but a little husk, 5% of you. It's like, well, if that 5% is solid, then maybe that's exactly what you want to have happen. The issue is there are times in your life where you know that the thing that you're saying is not true. It's a deception. It's a lie of some sort, and you're using it to manipulate yourself or another person or the world. And you're also possessed, fully possessed of the idea that you can get away with it. Where are you once you destroy your own ideal? What's left for you? There's nowhere to go. There's no up. And when there's no up, there's a lot of down. If you destroy your own ideal, which you do with jealousy and resentment and the desire to pull down people who you would like to be, let's say, then you end up in a situation that's indistinguishable from hell. Your moral degeneration contributes in no small way to the degeneration of the entire cosmos. Stop cheating at whatever game it is that you've chosen to play. That's a good start, and that'll straighten out your life. Just exactly what are your motives? If you're not doing something important with your life, maybe you're prone to cause trouble just because you don't have anything better to do. Because at least it's
trouble is more interesting than boring. And so if you're not doing something, if you're not pushing yourself to the limits of your capacity, then you have plenty of leftover willpower, energy, and resources to devote to causing interesting trouble. There are so many things that need doing that all you really have to do is open your eyes and look at them and then decide that you're actually going to do something about them. And you might think, well, what's within my scope of influence is so trivial that it's not worth doing. It's like, it won't stay trivial for long if you do it. Not at all. And I don't think it's trivial to begin with. I really don't believe that anything done right is trivial. And my experience in my life has been that anything I actually did paid off. It didn't pay off necessarily in the way that I expected it to pay off. That's a whole different story. But if it was genuine commitment to do something, even if it went sideways and the outcome was really something other than what I expected, the net consequence over time was nothing but good. So every new frontier that can be conquered is an advance forward, and there's no shortage of frontier because we're surrounded by the unknown. We're surrounded by our own ignorance, and that's the secret to proper being. If you're interested in life, if you're interested in proper being, and you're disinclined to produce any more suffering than necessary, then you want to know how to conduct yourself when the catastrophe comes so that you have a reasonable possibility of moving through it. If you dare to do the most difficult thing that you can conceptualize, your life will work out better than it will if you do anything else. Well, how are you going to find out if that's true? Well, it's a Kierkegaardian leap of faith. There's no way you're going to find out whether or not that's true unless you do it. So no one can tell you either. You have to be all in this game. There is no more effective way of operating in the world than to conceptualize the highest good that you can and then strive to attain it. There's no better pathway to self-realization and the ennoblement of being than to posit the highest good that you can conceive of and commit yourself to it. You can take whatever job you have and you can make it a real nice little piece of absolute misery. Or you can act like a civilized human being and notice that no matter where you are, there's a richness and a complexity that's completely inexhaustible right at hand. And then you can take that seriously and you can say, well, I can make it a lot better if I want to. I can get along properly with my coworkers and not gossip behind their back, and I can treat my customers properly. And if an opportunity comes my way, I can take it and I can see what happens. One of the things that I think this heightens the meaning in your life, is to try to do difficult things, right? Aim high. Don't aim so damn high you can't manage it, and make sure you break down your aims into reasonably attainable sub-goals, but you want to aim high, and then you want to see how hyper-efficient you can get. That's a great thing to do in your early 20s, is to see, okay, like discipline yourself. You think, okay, how much work can I do if I load myself right to the maximum? How far can I work? How hard can I work until I exhaust myself? And then you back off, obviously, because the optimal amount of working, productive engagement, let's say, is that which is sustainable across decades. So you have to learn that, but you don't learn that without stretching yourself to your limits to begin with. And, if your life isn't everything it could be, and if you're suffering from an excess of meaninglessness, well, it means you're not oriented in the world of chaos and order properly. It's like you could learn to discipline yourself. Figure out what it is that you need to do and that you want to do, and then see how efficient you can get. Because one of the things that's quite fun is to figure out, if you have a task, I always tell my graduate students this if they're doing an experiment too. If you have a task that you have to do, it's really interesting to spend a few minutes, sometimes hours, depending on how long the task is. See if you can figure out how to do it from 5 to 10 times faster. It means you'll have to rearrange the way you think about it, but you can often do it. And that's how extremely productive people get so hyper efficient. In order to have any positive meaning in your life, you have to have identified a goal, and you have to be working towards it. And there is a technical reason for that. And the technical reason, as far as I can tell, is that the circuitry that produces the kind of positive emotion that people really like is only activated when you notice that when you're proceeding towards a goal that you value. And so that means that if you don't have a goal that you value, you can't have any positive emotion. So technically that's the incentive reward system, and the underlying circuitry is dopaminergic. And
when that circuitry is activated, then it's part of the exploratory circuit. It gives you the sense of being actively engaged in something worthwhile. You tend to think of positive emotion as something produced by reward, but there's two kinds of positive emotion. One is the reward that's associated with satiation, and that's consummatory reward, and that's the reward you get when you're hungry and you eat. But the thing about eating when you're hungry is that it destroys the framework within which you were operating, right? It's time to eat. Well, you eat, and then that framework's no longer relevant, so the consummatory reward eliminates the value framework. And then you're stuck with, well, what are you going to do next? And so the consummatory reward has with it its own problems, but the incentive reward is constantly what keeps you moving forward. And incentive reward, because it's dopaminergic, also is analgesic, literally analgesic. So if you're in pain, you take opiates, and that will cut the pain, but so will psychomotor stimulants like cocaine or amphetamines. And so it's literally the case that if you're engaged in something that's engaging and you're working towards a goal, that you're going to feel less pain. And you can see this happening with athletes who, they'll break their thumb or something, or maybe sometimes even their ankle, and they'll keep playing the game. Of course, afterwards they're suffering like mad, but the fact that they're so filled with goal-directed enthusiasm means that, well, the pain systems are in some sense shut off. So that's an interesting thing, because what it suggests, then you could imagine, I might say, well, how happy are you that you've made a certain amount of progress? And if you think about it, what you'd say is, well, it depends on how much progress and in relationship to what. So hypothetically, you're going to be happier if you've made quite a bit of progress towards a really important goal. And then you have to think through what it means for a goal to be really important, because that's not obvious. Now, you could say, you're in this class and you're listening to some information, and maybe there's two reasons for that. You might find the information interesting per se, but let's forget about that for a minute. You need to listen to the information so that you can do well on the assignments, so that you can do well in the class. You need to do well in your classes so that you can finish up your degree. You need to finish up your degree so that you can find your place in the world. You need to do that so that you're financially stable, and maybe you can start a family and have a life, and that's all part of being a good person, something like that. And so that's a hierarchy of goals, and you might say that being a good person would be the thing, however vaguely thought through, that's at the top of that hierarchy. And then when you're doing things that serve that ultimate purpose, then you're going to find those more meaningful, and that meaning is actually produced as a consequence of the engagement of this exploratory circuit that's nested right down in your hypothalamus. It's really, really old. It's as old as thirst, and it's as old as hunger. It's really an old system. And so you want to have that thing activated.
It doesn't matter what your personal circumstances are. There's always something that isn't right near you, isn't correct, isn't laid out properly, that you could just fix if you wanted to. There's no shortage of opportunities to do that. You can do that in your own mind. You can do that in your own room. You can do that in your own household, in your local community. And maybe if you get good at doing it at all those levels, then you can start to look beyond that. If you adopt an attitude that the role that you should play is to make things better wherever you are, however you can, that what would actually happen would be that things would get better wherever you are. The world shifts itself around your aim, because you're a creature that has an aim. You have to have an aim in order to do something. You're an aiming creature. You look at a point and you move towards it. It's built right into you. So that sets up the world around you. It organizes all of your perceptions. It organizes what you see and you don't see. It organizes your emotions and your motivations. So you organize yourself around that aim. And then what happens is the day manifests itself as a set of challenges and problems. And if you solve them properly, then you stay on the pathway towards that aim. And you can concentrate on the day. And so that way you get to have your cake and eat it too, because you can point into the distance, the far distance, and you can live in the day. And it seems to me that makes every moment of the day supercharged with meaning, because if everything that you're doing every day is related to the highest possible aim that you can conceptualize, well, that's the very definition of the meaning that would sustain you in your life.
An uphill trajectory is actually even better than being somewhere good as far as I'm concerned, because one of the things that really makes your life meaningful is the clear realization that you're headed somewhere better than you are now. And then it's even better if you also understand that there's a direct causal relationship between the things that you're doing and the steepness of that incline. There's two modes of being in the world, right? There's one where you adopt the responsibility for living properly, for being properly, and you make the sacrifices necessary for doing that, and then everything will flourish properly. And the other one is a pathway of resentment and bitterness and rejection and genocide. If you make your life 0.1% better a week, man, in 2 or 3 years, you're in such a better place than you were that it isn't even like the same domain. And if you keep that up for 10 years or 20 years, you know, especially if you're young and you start early, you start to straighten yourself out and fix the things that you can fix, you can transform your lives in ways that are completely unimaginable. And God only knows what the upper limit of that is in terms of human possibility. The way, what you're actually made of, what you're made of is what you encounter when you voluntarily encounter the unknown. And so the more you voluntarily encounter the unknown, the more you get made of. And the more you get made of, the more there is to you. And then the more you're good at encountering the unknown and restructuring order and calling forth proper order out of the potential of being. And God, you got to think, why wouldn't you do that since you can do that? The fact that you're fragile is actually a precondition for your heroism, because if you weren't fragile, then there'd be nothing heroic about doing something difficult, right? Because if you couldn't be hurt or damaged or defeated or end up in failure, then where's the moral courage in the endeavor? It has to be that the fragility is built into the courage. People denigrate the opportunities that are right in front of them. And there's no reason to do that, because what's right in front of you is the majesty of being. That's what's right in front of you. It's inexhaustibly complex and full of potential, and there's no reason to assume that wherever you happen to be isn't as good a starting place as anywhere else. Well, I know some people have terrible, terrible lives. They're in situations that are absolutely unbearable. But I also do know that even situations like that can be made a hell of a lot worse by the worst kind of attitude. That's for sure. What I learned to do, I think, was to stop saying things that made me weak. I mean, I'm still trying to do that, because I'm always feeling when I talk whether or not the words that I'm saying are either making me align or making me come apart. I think alignment is the right way of conceptualizing it, because I think if you say things that are as true as you can say them, let's say, then they come out of the depths inside of you. Because we don't know where thoughts come from. We don't know how far down into your substructure the thoughts emerge. We don't know what processes of physiological alignment are necessary for you to speak from the core of your being. We don't understand any of that. We don't even conceptualize that, but I believe that you can feel that. I decided that I would start practicing not saying things that would make me weak. And what happened was that I had to stop saying almost everything that I was saying. I would say 95% of it. It's a hell of a shock to wake up and realize that, you know, and you might think, well, do you really want all of that to burn off? It's like, well, there's nothing left but a little husk, 5% of you. It's like, well, if that 5% is solid, then maybe that's exactly what you want to have happen. The issue is there are times in your life where you know that the thing that you're saying is not true. It's a deception. It's a lie of some sort, and you're using it to manipulate yourself or another person or the world. And you're also possessed, fully possessed of the idea that you can get away with it. Assuming you want to get better, there's usually something you can figure out that would constitute a step towards some sort of concrete goal. And my presumption, it's a behavioral presumption fundamentally, is that small accruing gains that repeat are unbelievably powerful. You can tyrannize yourself into doing things, but I wouldn't recommend it. What I would recommend instead is that you ask yourself what you're willing to do. It's a really effective technique. It's like a meditative technique. So, for example, you can get up in the morning and you can think, well, you know, I'd like to have a good day today, so I'd like to go to bed tonight without feeling guilty because I, didn't do some things I said I was going to do, and I'd like to have kind of an interesting day. So you got to fulfill my responsibilities, and I want to, enjoy the day. Then you can ask yourself, well, what would I have to do in order for that to happen that I would do? And the probability, if you practice this for 3 or 4 days, is your brain will just tell you, it'll say, well, you know, there's that piece of homework that you haven't done for like 3 weeks, you should knock that sucker off because it would only take you 10 minutes and you've been avoiding it and torturing yourself to death for 72 hours straight. And say, well, let's figure out what your aims are. You got to have some aims, whatever they are. And they might say, well, I'm so depressed I don't have any aims. And then I say, well, pick the least objectionable of the aims and act it out for a while and see what happens. Because sometimes your emotional systems are so fouled up that you have to pretend, you have to act the thing out before you can start to believe it. Life can be meaningful enough to justify its suffering. I thought, God, that's such a good idea. Because it's not optimistic exactly. You know, some people will tell you, well, you can be happy. It's like, those people are idiots. I'm telling you, they're idiots. There's going to be things that come along that flatten you so hard you won't believe it. And you're not happy then. And so if life is to be happy, well, in those situations, what are you doing? Why even live? But life isn't to be happy. If you're happy, you're bloody fortunate, and you should enjoy it. You should, because it's the grace of God, so to speak. People know when they're doing something meaningful. They can tell, so why the hell don't they do meaningful things all the time? It seems obvious. You could do it. I mean, it's hard, you know, because other people want you to do other things, and it's a struggle, but everything's a struggle. Oh, I get it. I see why. It took me about 10 years to figure this out. People have a choice. Choice number one, nothing you do means anything. Well, that's kind of a drag, right? It's meaninglessness of life and all that, existential angst. You know, that's kind of a pain. But the upside of nothing that you do is meaningful is you don't have to do anything. You've got no responsibility. Now, you have to suffer because things are meaningless, but that's a small price to pay. The alternative is everything you do matters. Really. If you make a mistake, it's a real mistake. If you betray someone, you tilt the world a little more sharply towards evil rather than good. It matters what you do. Well, if you buy that, then you can have a meaningful life. But there's no mucking around. It means responsibility. It means that the decisions you make are important. It means that when you do something wrong, it's wrong. Well, do you want that?
Regulate your habits. Try to get up at approximately the same time each morning. I would recommend that you get up approximately when other people get up. So that would be something in the neighborhood of 7:30 or 8 in the morning, perhaps earlier, perhaps a little bit later, but you want to stabilize that because your circadian rhythms operate more, fluidly, and your mood is likely to be regulated better if there's islands of stability in your daily routines. Human beings like daily routines, just like dogs like daily routines. And so regulate your sleep. I would say when you get up in the morning, eat breakfast. That's a really important thing to do. I can't tell you how many people I've treated in my clinical practice whose proclivity for emotional instability and depression, anxiety, general hopelessness, emotional pain and gloom and doom, as well as capacity to concentrate, were properly regulated or inhibited or reduced by merely ensuring that they ate I would say a protein and fat rich breakfast relatively soon after they wake up. And that's especially true if they're stressed. And as it turns out that if you stress yourself after a fast, which is of course what you've undertaken if you haven't eaten since the night before, that your body produces enough insulin to deplete the sugar in your blood. And then it's very difficult for you to become regulated properly with regards to your metabolism until you sleep again. And so it can be regulating your sleep, and your breakfast eating habits in particular can be a very effective way of regulating your mood and increasing your capacity to concentrate. The other thing I would say is that scheduling your time is also extraordinarily useful. And so I can tell you a little bit about how to use schedules effectively. You should develop a long-term plan. So you have to set up your long-term vision. And then I would say once you set up that vision so that you know how to orient yourself, then you should start designing your days. And you can do that very effectively with a calendar like Google Calendar. Many people say, well, I hate using a schedule or I hate using a calendar. What you're doing is using the calendar as an external tyrant that's telling you what you should do if you were going to be a conventionally good person each day. So you load yourself up with arbitrary responsibilities. But that's not really how you should use a schedule. What you should use a schedule to do is to design the day that you would most like to have. And obviously that's going to include accepting some responsibility and undertaking to make progress on those things that you have to make progress on to keep your life from collapsing into chaos. But it should also mean that you schedule in activities that make you actually want to have that day. And so if you're using a schedule properly, that it can be your friend. And that can also be something that can increase your capacity to concentrate. And then I would say, well, if you're very scattered, then you can start to train yourself. You might say, well, I need to learn to read without distraction. So maybe what you do, you say, okay, well, for the next week, I'm going to read 10 minutes a day, and I'm going to try to limit the distractions. And if you're successful at that, then you could try 12 minutes a day. And if you're successful at that, you could try 15 minutes a day. And the trick is to set a goal for yourself that is slightly beyond your current level of performance, enough to be challenging, enough to be worthwhile if you accomplish, but not so difficult that you're likely to fail. And then practice incrementally, day by day, trying to inculcate the habits that you want to inculcate. And assume that it'll take you a number of months or even a number of years in order to become very fluent at the habit. The important thing is to start improving incrementally, because incremental improvement pays off like compound interest.
Where are you once you destroy your own ideal? What's left for you? There's nowhere to go. There's no up. And when there's no up, there's a lot of down. If you destroy your own ideal, which you do with jealousy and resentment and the desire to pull down people who you would like to be, let's say, then you end up in a situation that's indistinguishable from hell. Your moral degeneration contributes in no small way to the degeneration of the entire cosmos. Stop cheating at whatever game it is that you've chosen to play. That's a good start, and that'll straighten out your life. We have to conserve the idea that the individual has an infinite responsibility to the direction of being. And we know that. You know perfectly well that you live in a relationship with your own conscience. And when you violate the moral order that's part and parcel of your soul, you're ashamed and hide and bitter. And then you get angry. You can't show your face to other people. You can't even look at yourself in the mirror. And you know perfectly well that's true, even though you may not know what to do about it or how to get out of it. There's a moral order built into human beings. If there wasn't, there's no way we could even communicate with one another, because there'd be no rules of communication. There'd be nothing that we mutually wanted or expected from each other. You know, one of the things I figured out is that we're all appalled when we run into another person who is not yet the Redeemer. Every person you ever meet, you're dissatisfied with because they're not who they could be. And you're broadcasting that message at everyone all the time. You're not who you could be. You're not who you could be. You're not who you could be. I'm not who I could be. And we're all facing each other with our emotional displays, pleading with each other to become that which we could become. And everyone knows it. But we won't do it. And it's no wonder. The postmodernists, they're the logical conclusion of the Nietzschean dilemma. God is dead. The value structure collapsed. The specter arises of all value structures collapsing. That's the postmodernist dogma. All value structures have collapsed. They're only there for the purposes of exclusion. They have no intrinsic value. It's a very, very powerful argument. That's why it dominates the universities. That and the fact that it allows people to dispense with their moral responsibility, which is something that's never discussed by the postmodernists. But you have to give the devil his due. What's the problem with postmodernism? Well, if all value structures have collapsed, then there's nothing to do. Because in order to do something, one thing has to be better than another, because otherwise, why do it? And so people who are ensconced in the postmodern tradition are undermined by their own philosophy. they can deconstruct their own deconstruction, in which case they might as well just sit there and do nothing, which would actually be preferable to what they're doing now. So how do they extract themselves from that dilemma? They do it illogically, but they don't care. Because the postmodernists, first of all, don't believe in logic. That's a reflection of the logos, which they've dispensed with. Dialogue they don't believe in, because that's a reflection of the logos, which they've dispensed with. Logic and dialogue are irrelevant. Well, that does bring up the problem of what to do. Well, the postmodernists finesse that by reverting to the Marxist doctrines from which postmodernism emerged. And so they say, well, yeah, you can't get any direction from postmodernism, but we're not going to worry about that because we don't worry about such things. What we'll do is just use sleight of hand to push forward the communitarian doctrines out of which our original hypothesis emerged. And everyone says, well, we'll turn a blind eye to the paradox because we actually need something to do. And plus, to the degree that we're communitarian, we can take out our nihilistic resentment and arrogance and ingratitude on every single person we deem to have something more than we have. And so if you're wondering why certain values can exist in the absence of any value, you have to look no farther than to understand that people who are desperate and chaotic will still be angry and destructive. And they can manifest that perfectly with the moral mask that says, well, I'm not really after what you have, because you have a little more than me. I'm speaking on behalf of these people who have even less. It's like, it's absolute nonsense. It's so funny watching Yale students complain about the privileged. They're in the top 1/10 of 100% of people who've lived in the entire history of the planet, much less just the people that are on the planet now. They're dominating patriarchs in training, right? They're baby representatives of the patriarchy. And all they do is complain about that tiny, tiny, infinitesimal fraction of people who have slightly more than they have now. It's appalling. And their idiot professors pat them on the back and send them out the world to do that instead of teaching them how to live. Well, as far as I can tell, the alternative is a proper return to the past, and that is precisely to journey into the chaos, to look at the worst possible thing, and to pull the dead father up from the chaotic depths. That's how you stop being a puppet. Someone whose strings are being pulled by forces they do not understand behind the scenes. You find out what's great about your culture, this thing that's provided us with everything that we see in this room, this amazing warmth that we're experiencing when it's 30 bloody below outside, the fact that the electricity is on and that computational resources are working and that we can all sit here peacefully and that no one is hungry. In fact, we're too fat. That's our big problem. Oh no, we have so much stuff we're getting fat. Yeah, well, that's a good problem to have. We should have some gratitude for what's been produced that's brought us to this point, and we need to wake up and understand what we're doing. That's what the psychoanalysts were trying to do in the 20th century. That's what all the great clinicians were trying to do, and I would say, above all else, that was what Carl Jung was trying to do. He believed firmly that the idea of the divine spark within the individual was a metaphysical reality, by which he meant a reality that actually transcended and existed superordinate to the physical reality, a more real reality. That's whatever consciousness is. Something we understand from a scientific perspective, not at all. That's been represented in our mythologies as far back as we can push them as an independent agent in the world, giving rise to form. That's how we treat each other. That's how we recognize ourselves. That's how we judge each other. You make your bed, and then you lie in it. And everyone knows it. And that's not to say that you're not subject to random and chaotic circumstances and the tragedy of life. Just because you can do some things doesn't mean you can do everything. But you can do some things, and if you don't do them, then things fall apart. Assuming you want to get better, there's usually something you can figure out that would constitute a step towards some sort of concrete goal. And my presumption, it's a behavioral presumption fundamentally, is that small accruing gains that repeat are unbelievably powerful. You can tyrannize yourself into doing things, but I wouldn't recommend it. What I would recommend instead is that you ask yourself what you're willing to do. It's a really effective technique. It's like a meditative technique. So for example, you can get up in the morning and you can think, well, you know, I'd like to have a good day today, so I'd like to go to bed tonight without feeling guilty because I, didn't do some things I said I was going to do, and I'd like to have kind of an interesting day. So you got to fulfill my responsibilities, and I want to, enjoy the day. Then you can ask yourself, well, what would I have to do in order for that to happen that I would do? And the probability, if you practice this for 3 or 4 days, is your brain will just tell you. It'll say, well, there's that piece of homework that you haven't done for like 3 weeks. You should knock that sucker off because it would only take you 10 minutes and you've been avoiding it and torturing yourself to death for 72 hours straight. And say, well, let's figure out what your aims are. You got to have some aims, whatever they are. And they might say, well, I'm so depressed I don't have any aims. And then I say, well, pick the least objectionable of the aims and act it out for a while and see what happens. Because sometimes your emotional systems are so fouled up that you have to pretend. You have to act the thing out before you can start to believe it. Life can be meaningful enough to justify its suffering. I thought, God, that's such a good idea. Because it's not optimistic exactly. Some people will tell you, well, you can be happy. It's like, those people are idiots. I'm telling you, they're idiots. There's going to be things that come along that flatten you so hard you won't believe it. And you're not happy then. And so if life is to be happy, well, in those situations, what are you doing? Why even live? But life isn't to be happy. If you're happy, you're bloody fortunate, and you should enjoy it. You should, because it's the grace of God, so to speak. People know when they're doing something meaningful. They can tell, so why the hell don't they do meaningful things all the time? It seems obvious. You could do it. I mean, it's hard, because other people want you to do other things, and it's a struggle, but everything's a struggle. Oh, I get it. I see why. It took me about 10 years to figure this out. People have a choice. Choice number 1. Nothing you do means anything. Well, that's kind of a drag, right? It's the meaninglessness of life and all that, existential angst. That's kind of a pain. But the upside of nothing that you do is meaningful is you don't have to do anything. You've got no responsibility. Now, you have to suffer because things are meaningless, but that's a small price to pay. The alternative is everything you do matters. Really. If you make a mistake, it's a real mistake. If you betray someone, you tilt the world a little more sharply towards evil rather than good. It matters what you do. Well, if you buy that, then you can have a meaningful life. But there's no mucking around. It means responsibility. It means that the decisions you make are important. It means that when you do something wrong, it's wrong. Well, do you want that? There's this old story in King Arthur where the knights go off to look for the Holy Grail, which is either the cup that Christ drank out of at the Last Supper or the cup into which the blood that gushed from his side was poured when he was crucified. The stories vary, but it's basically a holy object like the phoenix in some sense that's a representation of transformation. So it's an ideal, and so King Arthur's knights who sit at a round table, because they're all roughly equal, go off to find the most valuable thing, and where do you look for the most valuable thing when you don't know where it is? Well, each of the knights looks at the forest surrounding the castle and enters the forest at the point that looks darkest to him. And that's a good thing to understand, because the gateway to wisdom and the gateway to the development of personality, which is exactly the same thing, is precisely through the portal that you do not want to climb through. And the reason for that's actually quite technical. This is a Jungian presupposition too, is that, well, there's a bunch of things about you that are underdeveloped, and a lot of those things are because there's things you've avoided looking at because you don't want to look at them, and there's parts of you you've avoided developing because it's hard for you to develop those parts. And so it's by virtual necessity that what you need is where you don't want to look, because that's where you've kept it. And that's why there's an idiosyncratic element of it for everyone. Your particular place of enlightenment and terror is not going to be the same as yours, except that they're both places of enlightenment and terror. So they're equivalent at one level of analysis and different at another. So anyways, back to fiction and what it does. It distills truth, and it produces characters that are composites. And the more they become composites, the more they approximate a mythological character. And so they become more and more universally true and more approximating religious deities. But the problem with that is they become more and more distant from individual experience. And so with literature, there's this very tight line where you need to make the character more than merely human, but not so much of a god that, you know, one of the things that happened to Superman in the 1980s, Superman started out, he's got a heavenly set of parents, by the way, and an earthly set of parents, and he's an orphan like Harry Potter. Very common theme is that when Superman first emerged, he could only jump over buildings, you know, and maybe he could stop a locomotive. But by the time the 1980s rolled around, like, he could juggle planets and, you know, swallow hydrogen bombs, and, you know, he could do anything. Well, people stopped buying the Superman comics because how interesting is that? It's like something horrible happens and Superman deals with it. And something else horrible happens and Superman deals with it. And it's like, that's dull. He turned into such an archetype. He was basically the omniscient, omnipresent, omnipotent God, and that's no fun. It's like God wins, and then God wins again, and then again God wins, and, you know, so then they had to weaken him in different ways with kryptonite, you know. So green kryptonite kind of made him sick, and red kryptonite, I think, kind of mutated him, if I remember correctly. And anyways, they had to introduce flaws into his character so that there could be some damn plot. And that's something to think about, you know. There's a deep existential lesson in that your being is limited and flawed and fragile. You're like the genie, which is genius in the little tiny lamp, you know, this immense potential, but constrained in this tiny little living space, as Robin Williams said when he played the genie in Aladdin. But the fact that you have limitations means that the plot of your life is the overcoming of those limitations, and that if you didn't have limitations, well, there wouldn't be a plot, and maybe there would be no life. And so that's part of the reason why perhaps you have to accept the fact that you're flawed and insufficient, and live with it and consider it a precondition for being. It's at least a reasonable idea. So anyways, one of the main characters is the country, the known, the explored territory. We went over that a bit, and it always has two elements. I mean, your country is your greatest friend and your worst enemy, you know, because it squashes you into conformity and demands that you act in a certain manner, and reduces your individuality to that element that's tolerated by everyone else, and it constrains your potential in a single direction. And so it's really tyrannical, but at the same time it provides you with a place to be and all of the benefits that have accrued as a result of the actions of your ancestors and all the other people that you're associated with. So there's the good tyrant or the bad tyrant and the good king, and those are archetypal figures, and that's because they're always true, and they're always true simultaneously, you know, which is partly why I object to the notion of the patriarchy, because it's a it's the what do you call that? It's the apprehension of a mythological trope, which is that of the evil tyrant, without any appreciation for the fact that the archetype actually has two parts, and the other part is the wise king. And, you know, you can tell an evil tyrant story about culture, no problem, but it's one-sided, and that's very dangerous, because you don't want to forget all the good things that you have while you're criticizing all the ways that things are in error. That's a lack of gratitude, and it's a lack of wisdom, and it's founded in resentment, and it's very dangerous, both personally and socially. I told you that Captain Hook is a tyrant because he's got this crocodile chasing him, and the crocodile has a clock in its stomach, and that's death. It's like, obviously, right? Tick, 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 tick. And it's a crocodile, and it's under the water, and it's already got a taste of him, so he's being chased around by death, and that makes him terrified and resentful and cruel and bitter, and so he's a tyrant. and he wants to wreak havoc everywhere. And then Peter Pan, of course, looks at Captain Hook and thinks, why the hell should I grow up and to be a tyrant and sacrifice all the potential of childhood? And the answer to that is, the potential sacrifices itself if you don't utilize it as you mature, and you just end up a 40-year-old lost boy, which is a horrifying thing to behold. It's almost as if you're the corpse of a child, the living corpse of a child, because who the hell wants a 6-year-old, 40-year-old? You're a little on the stale side by that point, and not the world's happiest individual. So, you know, your potential is going to disappear because you age anyways, and so you might as well shape that potential in a particular direction and at least become something, no matter how limited, rather than nothing. So, you know, Peter Pan, that's a great story. It's a great mythological story. So, well, so let's talk about tyrants. Well, not only are they mythological figures, but they exist and they tend to be deified. I mean, Stalin was, for all intents and purposes, God the Father in Soviet Russia, although he was pretty much only the worst elements of Old Testament God, who was, you know, constantly smiting people and wiping out populations and doing all sorts of things that seemed to be quite nasty. But nonetheless, you know, people worshipped him in many ways, and he's a representation of just exactly what goes wrong when things really go wrong, when people stop paying attention and when they all lie. Because one of the things that characterized the communist state was that no one ever got to say anything they actually believed, ever. And that was partly because 1 out of 3 people was an informer, which meant if you had a family of 6 people, 2 of them were informing on the government about you, and that included your own children. And if you were an informer, you were often amply rewarded by the state, so that if you lived in an overcrowded apartment building with 3 families in the same flat, and you informed on, you know, the woman down the hall that you didn't like, she got shipped off to the old concentration camp, and you got her apartment. And so that was a lovely society, and it only killed about 30 million people between 1919 and 1959. So that's what happens when the archetypal structure gets tilted badly, when people forget that they have a responsibility to fulfill as citizens, as awake citizens who are capable of stating the truth, and the archetype shifts, so there's nothing left of the great father except the tyrant. And let's not have that happen. I mean, the one on the right is really interesting, because consciously or unconsciously, you know, there's Stalin surrounded by what is, for all intents and purposes, fire. You know, he looks like Maleficent in Sleeping Beauty when she shows up at Aurora's christening. You know, she puts her arms up in the air and green fire surrounds her. It's like he's surrounded by fire, and there's Lenin above him, who's like king of the fiery realm, and that's for sure. So, I mean, all the terrors that happened in the Soviet Union didn't start under Stalin, they started under Lenin, and Stalin was definitely Lenin's legitimate son, let's put it that way. And I would, you know, think about this, because I'll tell you what it is that you need to do to be successful. Some of these things aren't so malleable, but others are things that you can work on. Well, IQ, well, that's a rough one, because there's no evidence, as far as I can tell, that you can do a damn thing about your IQ. I was just reading a paper by Dan Simon today. It's a relatively recent review. Dan Simon did the Invisible Gorilla stuff, and he was looking, because there's all these companies that claim that these online brain training exercises can produce cognitive improvements, and he reviewed the literature again. And I've reviewed that literature like 6 times in the last 15 years, because I keep hoping that someone will crack the problem, but it's always the same answer. It's like, you do brain training games, you get better at the game, a lot better at that game. You get slightly better at similar games, but distal games that are still heavily cognitively loaded doesn't affect your performance at all. 0, none. So the issue of how to raise IQ, man, that's a killer. No one knows how to do it. I can tell you how to stop your IQ from decreasing as you get older. That's not so bad, because it does that. Fluid IQ decreases from the time you're 20, and pretty rapidly. It's physical health is the best preventative. So exercise, physical exercise. weirdly enough. You know, you think, well, why? Well, your brain uses oxygen like mad, right? And it needs to be kept clean and well oxygenated. And physical exercise, both like weightlifting, so anaerobic and aerobic exercise both seem to be very, very effective at staving off cognitive declines across the lifespan. So that's a really useful thing to know, because that's the only thing we know that does that. So then the next best predictor of lifetime success is conscientiousness. Well, so, and of the two aspects of conscientiousness, say orderliness and industriousness, the better predictor is industriousness. So the question is, well, what can you do about your industriousness? And the answer to that is, well, that's kind of rough too, because there's a strong genetic component. But you can work on micro habits with regards to your conscientiousness. And I think the best micro habits, this is partly to do with this future authoring program processes, I think the best thing you can do with regards to your conscientiousness is to set up some aims for yourself, goals that you actually value. And the future authoring program helps people do that. And basically, it does a situational analysis of, it helps you do a situational analysis of your life more than a psychological analysis, I would say. And so the questions are something like, well, all right, you're going to have to put some effort into your life. And you need to be motivated to do that. And so what are the potential sources of motivation? Well, you could think about them in the big five manner. You know, if you're extroverted, you want friends. If you're agreeable, you want an intimate relationship. If you're disagreeable, you want to win competitions. If you're open, you want to engage in creative activity. If you're high in neuroticism, you want security. Okay, so those are all sources of potential motivation that you could draw on, that you could tailor to your own, you know, your own personality. But then there are dimensions that you want to consider your life across. And so we ask people about, well, you know, if you could have your life the way you wanted it in 3 to 5 years, if you were taking care of yourself properly, you know, what would you want from your friendships? What would you want from your intimate relationship? How would you like to structure your family? What do you want for your career? Well, how are you going to use your time outside of your job? And how are you going to regulate your mental and physical health, and maybe also your drug and alcohol use? Because that's a good place to auger down, you know, because alcoholism, for example, wipes out, you know, 5 to 10% of people. So you want to keep that under control. And then so maybe, you know, you develop a vision of what you would like your life to be, and that associates the goal. Well, once the goal is established, and then you break down the goal into micro processes that you can implement, the micro processes become rewarding in proportion, in relation to their causal association with the goal, and that tangles in your incentive reward system. You know, we talked about the dopaminergic incentive reward system, and that's the thing that keeps you moving forward. And the way it works is that it works better if it produces positive emotion when it can see you moving towards a valued goal. Okay, well, what's the implication of that? Better have a valued goal, because otherwise you can't get any positive motivation working out. And so the more valuable the goal, in principle, the more the micro processes associated with that goal start to take on a positive charge. And so what that means is, well, you get up in the morning and you're excited about the day, you're ready to go. And so as far as I can tell, what you do is you specify your long-term ideal. Maybe you also specify a place you want to stay the hell away from, so that you're terrified to fail as well as excited about succeeding, because that's also useful. You specify your goal. You do that in some sense as a unique individual. You want to specify goals that make you say, oh, if that could happen as a consequence of my efforts, it would clearly be worthwhile. Because the question always is, why do something? Because doing nothing is easy. You just sit there and you don't do anything. That's real easy. The question is, why would you ever do anything? And the answer to that has to be because you've determined by some means that it's worthwhile. And then the next question might be, well, where should you look for worthwhile things? And one would be, well, you could consult your own temperament. And the other would be, well, you kind of look at what it is that people accrue that's valuable across the lifespan. So you do a structural analysis of the subcomponents of human existence, and I already did that. You need a family, you need friends. Like, you don't need to have all these things, but you better have most of them. Family, friends, career, educational goals, plans for, you know, time outside of work, attention to your mental and physical health, etc. You know, that's what life is about. And if you don't have any of those things, well, then all you've got left is misery and suffering. So that's a bad deal for you. So once you set up that goal structure, let's say, and that's really in many ways that's what you should be doing at university. That's exactly what you should be doing, is trying to figure out who it is that you're trying to be, right? And you aim at that, and then you use everything you learn as a means of building that person that you want to be. And I really mean want to be. I don't mean should be. Even those things are going to overlap. And it's important to distinguish between those, because that's partly, and this is back down to the micro routine analysis. So if I was saying, well, you're going to try to make yourself more industrious. Okay, number one, specify your damn goals, because how are you going to hit something if you don't know what it is? That isn't going to happen. And often people won't specify their goals too, because they don't like to specify conditions for failure. So if you keep yourself all vague and foggy, which is real easy, because that's just a matter of not doing as well, then you don't know when you fail. And people might say, well, I really don't want to know when I fail, because that's painful. So I'll keep myself blind about when I fail. That's fine, except you'll fail all the time then. You just won't know it until you've failed so badly that you're done. And that can easily happen by the time you're 40. So I would recommend that you don't let that happen. So that's willful blindness, right? You could have known, but you chose not to. Okay, so once you get your goal structure set up, you think, okay, if I could have this life, it looks like that might be worth living, despite the fact that it's going to be, anxiety provoking and threatening, and there's going to be some suffering and loss involved and all of that. Obviously, the goal is to have a vision for your life such that, all things considered, that justifies your effort. Okay, so then what do? Well, then you turn down to the micro routines. It's like, okay, well, this is what I'm aiming for. How does that instantiate itself day to day, week to week, month to month? And that's where something like a schedule can be unbelievably useful. Google Calendar. It's like, make a damn schedule and stick to it. Okay, so what's the rule with a schedule? It's not a bloody prison. That's the first thing that people do wrong. They say, well, I don't like to follow a schedule. Well, it's like, well, what kind of schedule are you setting up? Well, I have to do this, then I have to do this, then I have to do this, and then I just go play video games, because who wants to do all these things that I have to do? It's like, wrong. Set the damn schedule up so that you have the day you want. That's the trick. It's like, okay, I've got tomorrow. If I was going to set it up so it was the best possible day I could have, practically speaking, what would it look like? Well, then you schedule that. And obviously there's a bit of responsibility that's going to go along with that, because if you have any sense, one of the things that you're going to insist upon is that at the end of the day, you're not in worse shape than you were than at the beginning of the day, right? Because that's a stupid day. If you have a bunch of those in a row, you just dig yourself a hole and then you bury yourself in it. It's like, sorry, that's just not a good strategy. It's a bad strategy. So maybe 20% of your day has to be responsibility and obligation, or maybe it's more than that, depending on how far behind you are. But even that, you can ask yourself, okay, well, I've got these responsibilities. I have to schedule the damn things in. What's the right ratio of responsibility to reward? And you can ask yourself that, just like you'd negotiate with someone who is working for you. It's like, okay, you got to work tomorrow. Okay, so I want you to work tomorrow. And you might say, okay, well, what are you going to do for me that makes it likely that I'll work for you? Well, you could ask yourself that, So maybe you do an hour of responsibility and then you play a video game for 15 minutes. I don't know, whatever turns your crank, man. But, you have to negotiate with yourself and not tyrannize yourself. Like you're negotiating with someone that you care for, that you would like to be productive and have a good life. And that's how you make the schedule. It's like, and then you look at the day and you think, well, if I had that day, that'd be good. Great. And you're useless and horrible, so you'll probably only hit it with about 70% accuracy, but that beats the hell out of 0, right? And if you hit it even with 50% accuracy, another rule is, well, aim for 51% the next week, or 50.5% for God's sake, or because you're going to hit that position where things start to loop back positively and spiral you upward. And so that's one way that you can work on your conscientiousness, is plan a life you'd like to have. And you do that partly by referring to social norms. That's more or less rescuing your father from the belly of the whale. But the other way you do that is by having a little conversation with yourself about, as if you don't really know who you are, because you know what you're like. You won't do what you're told. You won't do what you tell yourself to do. You must have noticed that. It's like you're a bad employee and a worse boss, and both of those work, for you. You don't know what you want to do, and then when you tell yourself what to do, you don't do it anyways. You should fire yourself and find someone else to be. You have to be tough as a damn boot to be good, because you have to stand your ground when you need to stand your ground, and you have to be able to say no when it's time to say no, and you have to mean it. And so then you have to think and plan strategically so that when you're going to say no, you can mean it and it will stick. You know, and that takes a certain amount of integrated malevolence, I would say. And once it's integrated, it's not malevolence, it's strength. It's strength of character. It's the ability to stand your ground. And you have to cultivate that. And you cultivate that at least in part by telling the truth. And so you take your place in the world as a decent person and as a decent citizen, and you play the hierarchical game properly. And that is to stand up straight with your shoulders back. It's like the world's an onslaught. You've got the tyranny of culture to deal with. You've got the catastrophe of nature. You've got your own damn malevolence and ignorance, right? All coming at you, plus the incredible, complicated, indeterminate potential of the future. That's all coming at you, and it's all your responsibility. And you can cringe away from it and be afraid of it and be victimized by it and be bitter and cynical about it. And no wonder, because it can be painful. Or you can turn around and you can say, man, bring it on, because there's more to me than there is to the catastrophe. And this is what I discovered from looking at what I looked at. I looked at the darkest things I could look at, really, for 30 years. I was really a lot of fun to be around, I can tell you. I looked at the darkest things that I could think of, right? Not only what happened in Auschwitz and what happened in the Gulag, but personal issues. You know, it's like I wasn't so much interested in the totalitarians as a group. I was interested in the people who undertook the terrible acts that the totalitarians required. You know, the people who, I was just rereading Ordinary Men, and it was a story about a police battalion in Poland that trained ordinary policemen to take naked pregnant women out into the fields and shoot them in the back of the head. It takes a lot of training, by the way, before you can bring yourself to do that. And you aren't the same person by the end of it. It's pretty goddamn horrific. You know, and I was trying to figure out, what would it be like to be that person? Because we are that person. And then what would it be like to not be that person, right? To refuse to do that, to not participate in that. You know, and what I discovered by making that totalitarian proclivity personal was that there's more to us than there is to the horror. As nature is, bent on our destruction, bad as culture is, tyrannical and bloody, back as far as you can look, as malevolent as you are in the darkest part of your heart, and that's plenty malevolent. The possibility that's within you that can well up, the courage and the truth and the ability and the skill and the willingness to set things right, if you are willing to set them right, is more powerful than all of that. And so it's so interesting. It was proof for me of an old saying I read from Carl Jung. It's an alchemical motif, in stir qualinus inventur, which is what you most want to be found will be found where you least want to look, essentially. And it's so interesting because it means that if you're willing to turn around and to stand up straight and face the darkness like fully, what you discover at the darkest part is the brightest light. And that's something that's so much worth discovering, because there's going to be terrible darkness in your life. And it's going to make you cynical and bitter. And it could easily be that you're just not looking at it enough. Because if you looked at it enough and you didn't shy away and you brought everything you had to bear on it, you'd find that there was more to you than there was to the horror. You know, I watched my father-in-law. I'll end with this. And you know, you don't know, because you're not bringing your A game to the table with all that cynicism and bitterness and resentment and willful blindness and avoidance. Maybe you're playing at 60%. It's not good enough, because there's too much of what's bad for 60% to be good enough. It's like you need 90% or 95% or 100%. When about 15, 20 years ago, my mother-in-law developed
frontal temporal dementia, which I wouldn't recommend. You know, it's one of those degenerative neurological diseases like Alzheimer's, and those bloody things are, like, they're in the top echelon of awful. You know, you watch a person deteriorate before your eyes. It's a lengthy, lengthy death. And it was slow. And her husband, he lived in this little town that I grew up in, about 3,000 people. And he was quite a character, man. Everybody knew him. I bought him a Foghorn Leghorn t-shirt once, because that's kind of what he was like. He was loud and sort of bombastic, but he stood up straight, I can tell you. And he played the fool a little bit, mostly for the amusement of people, but he was no damn fool. And I always admired him and liked him. And the feeling was mutual, thank God, since I married his daughter. And, you know, he drank a lot with his crazy friends up in northern Alberta, and he wasn't at home a lot because he was working a lot. And you know, he was kind of a party animal about town, but a good businessman and a good man. And then his wife got sick, and they moved to another town. And, you know, he took care of her for like 15 years. It was unbelievable as she deteriorated, you know, and she got more desperate to have him around, and her love for him never went away. Even as she lost herself almost completely, she would always light up when he came into the room, you know. And he took care of her right till within weeks of her death. He had to finally put her in an old folks' home because he was no longer strong enough to lift her up from the chair. And we interacted with him a lot, you know, because we were trying to help him figure out how to cope. And we had signs put up in the house, electronic signs that would tell her when he was leaving, so that she would know where he went. And we had recordings in the bathroom so that she knew what to do when she went into the bathroom. And we tried to do everything we could to not make this absolutely bloody, atrocious experience complete hell. And he participated the whole way, you know, and it was really something to see. It was really it left me with a tremendous sense of admiration for him, but not just for him, but for people who can do that, you know. And if there was a new decline, he took it on, and he didn't complain about it, and he tried to do what he could, you know. And like, it was no picnic, don't get me wrong, but it wasn't hell. And then we were all gathered around the deathbed, my wife's mother's deathbed, and the family was there, and they got along pretty well, you know. Her sister's a palliative care nurse, and the other one's a pharmacist, and none of them are particularly afraid of illness and death. You know, they're a pretty tough group. And so, you know, they made sure their mother's lips were wet while she was no longer eating or drinking, and tried to make her comfortable. And they're around the deathbed, and they were kind of getting along, you know. It wasn't Family Feud at mother's death time, and that was kind of nice. And she died, and that was that. But it wasn't just that, because the fact that the family had coped with it well and nobly and honorably, I would say, brought them together. They were closer afterwards than they were before. And they all had more respect for their father. And then in the old folks' home, he met another woman who had a husband there who had Alzheimer's. And they got to know each other, you know. And he died after a while, and she died after a while. And then a few months later, they started going out. And then eventually they had a relationship, and now they live together. And so he gained something. Like, it wasn't that he replaced what he lost, you know what I mean? Because he still has pictures of his wife up in his house, and she was the love of his life, and that's not going away. But, you know, his family respected him more, and everybody pulled together more, and it wasn't hell at the deathbed, it was just tragedy, and the family pulled together more. And that was a good example of how you can extract at least a certain amount of light out of what's dark, even at a personal level. And it's worth asking yourself. It's like, drop what you're doing that's foolish, that you know is foolish, and pick an aim that's worthwhile, you know, to make things better for yourself, like you're worth taking care of, like you're worth something, you know, and to surround yourself with people who believe the same, and who are rejoicing in your accomplishments and unhappy when you fail, right? And you're comparing yourself to your accomplishments of yesterday and not to someone else's today, so that you're not jealous and bitter. And you put your own house in order so that you're not cursing the world when some of its disarray might be your fault. And you're trying to pursue something meaningful, and you're doing your best to tell the truth, and all of that. And then you see what happens. who the hell are you? You know, you think you're a miracle of some bloody bizarre sort. We've been around for 3.5 billion years. You know, every single one of your relatives propagated successfully. And here you are, against all possible odds, in this world of hell in some sense, and bitterness and tyranny and malevolence. And yet, God only knows what's inside you, this capacity for consciousness, the capacity to confront potential and to turn it into something good. That's us, man. That's the Western story. That's the individual as the cornerstone of the state. That's our responsibility, and it really is who we are.
What happens to you as you stroll merrily on your way through life? Well, what happens is that as you're moving from point A to point B, you encounter things. And people think that what they encounter are objects, but that's not the case. First of all, most of the things that you encounter, many of the things are actually other people, and they're not objects. They're too damn complex. And even apart from the social world, the things that you encounter aren't objects. They seem to be something more like tools or obstacles. And I don't mean that we see objects and turn them into tools or obstacles. I mean that we see tools and obstacles, because what happens is that when you array yourself towards a goal, then the world transforms itself into things that get in the way of that goal, and three things. Things that get in the way of the goal, those are things you don't like. Things that facilitate your movement towards the goal, those are things that you like, and irrelevant things. And mostly you want irrelevant things, because there's just too damn many things. So the category of irrelevant is one you really like. So most of everything is irrelevant if you have a good plan. A few things are good because they move you forward, and some other things are not so good. You want to go around the not so good things if you can manage them, unless you like to run head forth into like brick walls, which is not particularly, it's a learning experience, but I wouldn't repeat it too many times. You want the world to array itself as a set of, we could say, tools. Now, what happens is that you have this perceptual system that's mediated by dopamine. It's the same system that cocaine activates, or methamphetamine, or the drugs that people really like to take. And it's the dopaminergic system that responds with positive emotion to indications that you've encountered something that will facilitate your movement towards a goal. And that's really important to know, because people tend to think that they're happy because they achieve goals, and that's not true. What's true, because as soon as you achieve a goal, then you have a problem, which is what's the next goal. And that's actually a big problem. You encounter that as soon as you graduate from university, for example. That's right. I made this joke before. Graduation day, you're like king of the university hierarchy, undergraduate hierarchy. Day after, you're unemployed potential Starbucks employee, right? So it's like, so obviously the accomplishment per se as a source of reward is problematic, because when you accomplish, you run the frame to its end, and then you have the problem of needing a new frame. So that's a problem. But if what you're encountering instead are things that will move you along your way, it's like, hey, that's great, and that's where you get your positive motivation. And so that's really that's so much worth thinking about. You can think about that for a year, and that wouldn't even be enough to think about it, because here's what it means. It means, in some sense, that the Buddhists are right with their claim about Maya, M-A-Y-A, which means that people live in an illusion. And what they mean by that is, well, you have goal, whatever your goal is, and that goal gives relevance to the world. And you could change the relevance of the world in a snap, just by changing your goal. You can do that. And so then you think, well, it's sort of an illusion, because you can just change it. Now, you don't want to push that line of argumentation too far, because even if the specific point can be changed, the fact that you're in one of these frames cannot be changed. And so you have to be in a frame, although you get to pick the frame. So there's still an absolute there, which is that you have to be in a frame, and that is not a trivial absolute. It's a very major absolute. So then you think, okay, all of your positive emotion is going to be experienced in relationship to the goal. Well, then we think, well, you could use some positive emotion. It's a good thing. Positive emotion inhibits anxiety and disappointment and frustration and pain. It does all that. Technically, it does that. That's why a football player with a broken thumb who wants to score a touchdown can go out there and, play the football game, even though it's a kind of an arbitrary goal, right? It's like, really, you're going to go out there and like risk your hand to fire a pigskin through some poles. It's like, well, you can say the same sort of cynical thing about most of the things that people do, but you can't say the cynical thing about the fact that they have to do things. So you have a point, you have your aim, you have your ambition, and then that's what turns the world into a potentially positive place. And here's the kicker. This is so cool. The higher the aim, the more the positive emotion. So that's you think, well, why should I bother? You know, why should I bother doing something lofty and difficult? It's like, because it's worth it. That's why. Because the alternative is stupid suffering. Because really, because what happens is, like, you don't need a framework in order to suffer. You can just lay there day after day and suffer, right? That's easy. So that's the default condition. If you don't have a lofty ambition, then you suffer miserably. And the reason for that is life is really complex, short, finite, full of suffering, and beyond you. And so you can just lay there and think about that, and it's horrible. And so that's not helpful. It's just not useful. And so, you know, people often say life is meaningless. It's like, no, it's not. That's wrong. Because if it was meaningless, that'd be easy. You could just sit there and do nothing, and it wouldn't matter, right? It'd be like you were like a lobotomized sheep. It's just irrelevant. But that isn't what happens. When people say that life has no meaning, that isn't what they mean. What they mean is, I'm suffering stupidly and intensely, and I don't know what to do about it. Well, the suffering is meaningful. It's just not the kind of meaning you want. So how do you get out of that? You adopt, you note the baseline of suffering, which is very, 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 very high. And then you say to yourself, okay, I need to do something that justifies that. And that's not so easy, because the baseline for suffering is high. If you're going to make something of yourself, let's say, so that it's worthwhile to exist in the world, then you have to aim at something that's so well structured that you can say, yeah, earthquakes, cancer, death of my family, dissolution of my goals, ultimate futility of life, and the heat death of the universe. Hey, it doesn't matter, it's worth it.
And so this is a good thing for people to know. If something bothers you, there's a billion things that could bother you, and not everything does. And so then you might ask, well, why does that thing bother you when some other thing that's equally bad doesn't? And as far as I can tell, the answer to that is because if it bothers you, that's your problem. And you might think, I don't want to have a problem. It's like, that's because you don't know that problems and opportunities are the same thing. So if a problem's crying out to you, then it could well be that your proper destiny is to address that problem, in which case it's an immense opportunity. And you saw that, exactly that. Oh, look, there's an absence in the marketplace. Well, that's a good discovery, an absence in the marketplace, especially if you're right. And so that's what you did. And then you got a movie out of it. So that's a pretty good deal.
Yeah.
You know, and that's independent of its eventual success as a movie, because even if it lands at any of the levels of success it could land at, you got to make a movie. And so that's pretty good. And God only knows what you learn doing that. So there's no loss in that, right?
Yeah.
There's just gain.
There was an interesting thing that I realized during this whole thing, and it is related to what you just said. So for many years, I have told people that if you have an idea and you don't execute on it, your idea doesn't mean anything. Ideas are a dime a dozen, and it doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
And what I realized in making this movie is that I was actually wrong.
Okay.
Because if an idea, it's worthless if you don't execute it on it. I get that. But the actual idea, that if you have an idea, if you have an idea and it's good,
Yeah.
you can't even put a price tag on that thing. And that's why when you look at Hollywood makes a bunch of what are they called? Like reruns of the same movies, right? Yeah. There's a reason for that. They have all this money to throw at ideas, and they just go, well, you know what? Make the superhero movie again, make the space movie again. They just make the same movies often over and over again. And I realized that these, you know, if you have a really good idea, you have to execute on it. You have to do something with it, because if you don't, it's like a mortal sin not to execute on a good.
Well, it's a revelation, a good idea. It's a gift. It's
and that's one of the
grace.
things, where does it come from? That's why I was kind of very
That's
curious when you
exactly
said that,
right.
because
I know the answer to that.
I look at it like, you know, they know what molecules are in an amoeba, right?
Yeah.
We know what chemicals, and we know what's in it, but we can't make an amoeba. We can't make something alive. And just like in a movie or a book or a song, they know, you go to Nashville, they know what notes make a hit song, but they can't just produce a hit song. They can put all the chemicals in there, but they can't bring it to life. And so there is, just like there's something special about life, there's a spark that we don't understand. We can't fabricate it. We cannot fabricate that spark in life. And we can't, as far as I can tell, we can't fabricate that spark of an idea.
Okay, so there's a bunch of things that come off that. So one of the things I realized, so I've done a lot of lecturing again this year. I don't know how many different cities we went to, 60 or 70, you know, over the last 8 months, maybe more than that, a lot. And I've you know, I have a chance to develop my ideas every night. One of the things I came to understand more clearly was, this is a very cool thing, and it's relevant to what you just said, is that the spirit of your aim, you could say, answers your prayers or informs your thoughts. And it has to be that way, because thought is a navigation tool, right? You set an aim, and then your perceptions line up so you can see your way forward, but your thoughts and your emotions also aid that, because otherwise, because you want to get there, let's say. And then the methods by which you might advance come to mind because you've set your aim. Okay, so we can take this apart in this idea that came to you. It's like you wanted to serve your children. Okay, you wanted to serve them in a manner that was better than what was being served to them. You wanted to serve them in a manner that would help them develop in this adventurous way. So that was your goal, your aim, when you went to the library. And then what happened was there was a mismatch between what you discovered and your aim. And so now that constitutes a problem, but it also constitutes an opportunity, right? Because now you see that if your aim was correct and there's a void, well, then that's a moral problem even. Okay, so now if it's a moral problem because your aim was right and the mechanisms for that aim to be manifested aren't available, well, then that's a genuine gap and it needs to be addressed. And if you figure that out, it's your moral responsibility to do something about it, but it's also your great opportunity. Okay, so there's that. So that's what you're serving. If your aim is correct and true, and you have a revelation in relationship to that aim, and you don't act on it, you've thrown away the pathway to that aim, and you've betrayed it. That's not a good idea. But even more concretely, one of the things my wife has really learned to do in the last 2 years, she started to write and she started to speak publicly because she introduces me and talks for about 10 minutes. And she's learned during our discussions, our private discussions, let's say, if an idea emerges, she writes it down right away, no matter what we're doing, right? The idea comes, you write that thing down because it's a gift and God only knows what it's worth. You know, you could have a good idea now and then. It might be a good idea that changes your whole life. And you could have that idea and be casual enough to forget it. And that was that. And then you'd wonder why you never got anywhere. It's like, well, you had a gift and you didn't. And then there's another issue too, is the things that meet with reward grow. That's a neurological truth. That's how large language models are trained. They're trained with reinforcement. The closer they get to the target, the more weight is put on that response. So it's literally reward that trains large language models to match to target. Well, if you have a bit of a creative spark and and ideas are being revealed to you in concordance with your aim, and then you don't act on those, you punish them. You punish the source of the ideas. Just like demoralizing a kid. Like if a kid comes to you with ideas and every time they come, you say, oh, that's stupid, or what the hell do you know? Or you say, I'm going to do something about that, and then you don't. That kid will stop coming to you with ideas. And people do that to themselves all the time. Yeah. And so you even have an obligation to you can watch this, you know. This is what I've been trying to teach people too, is if you want to improve your life, it's like, well, set that as an aim. I'd like things to be better. And then ask, what could I actually do that would move me somewhat in that direction? You'll get an answer. That's a good way to pray. That's a good way to pray.
And I've experienced two things here, and these are like the opposite ends of the spectrum. And this is, I think, a very positive thing for people to hear. If I was a young person, I would really like to hear this. So there are going to be times like you're talking about with your wife where all of a sudden from nowhere, or from somewhere, but somewhere that we don't know and understand, all of a sudden there's an idea there.
The source of all revelation.
It shows up.
Yeah.
It shows up. I've had that happen to me where it's like, boom, I wrote a book called Mikey and the Dragons. That came just boom. I just instantly had this idea. Boom, I wrote the book.
Yeah.
And I remember when I was an English major in college, and some of the old poets, they would claim that, you know, they just wrote this first, you know, the first draft, that was it. It was one draft, one shot. And there was sort of rumors about these that's not really happened. They found their notes. They'd written a bunch of drafts. But sometimes it's true. Sometimes you will get that inspiration, it'll come and boom, you're done.
Yeah.
So you can sit around and wait for that. I don't recommend waiting for that, though. It may or may not come.
Yeah.
We can't control that. The other side of the spectrum, which I've also had this happen to me, and my silly term that I came up with for it is squeezing your brain. You have to like squeeze your brain and squeeze something out of it. And what I like is this idea, just to come full circle a little bit here. You know, I had this thing where I wanted to have lessons for my kids that they could read in a book.
Yeah.
And so I have that. There's my aim, what you would call an aim.
Yeah.
Well, I didn't immediately say, oh, okay, what I can have as a kid that's going through kind of kid problems and his uncle who's a Navy SEAL can come and stay with him for the summer and he can teach him. I didn't have that. And I definitely didn't have the nuances of like, oh, he can get bullied by this kid. And he can time save.
That fills in.
Right. But I squeezed on my brain and thought, what would be a good, and then all of a sudden, boom, you just start, you find your path and the story will come or the idea will come. And
well, that's part of that disciplined striving. Like I learned when I first started writing, I forced myself to sit and write every day. And some days I was highly productive and other days I wasn't so productive. But every day, if I sat long enough, I was a little bit productive. And then I got better at being productive and much better at not delaying sitting down. That took a long time, really years to really get disciplined. I'm still learning that discipline, right? I mean,
how long do you write for at a time?
I max out about 3 hours. Okay. I find that if I write more than 3 hours continually, I get exhausted. So 3 hours is about right. And I've learned tricks like at the end of the writing session, write down what you're thinking so you can use that the next day and do it every day and so on. And I've got to the point now where I can write a newspaper article, a good newspaper article, pretty much in one draft, but that's taken 35 years of writing to manage that. But I learned early that if I sat long enough, I would write something that would be valuable, right? And some days it took like 45 minutes to get warmed up so that, you know, everything I wrote was just painful to produce and not of very high quality. But if you persist, the thing that persistence, that's the other thing that's kind of interesting neurologically. You know, I already said if you punish the source within you that gives rise to ideas, it will stop producing ideas. So that's a bad idea. But it's also the case that you want to make being creative the victor over all the competing pulls and temptations. And partly what you're doing when you're disciplining yourself is that. It's like, no, I'm going to sit here, regardless of all the other things I could be doing, all the other things I could be thinking, until that part of me that's able to create wins that internal battle and prevails. And then it gets stronger and stronger over time. And that's building character. That's exactly what that is.
Does consciousness die with the body and is meaning doomed like the universe?
Well, I don't know, I would say. I mean, we don't understand consciousness. We don't really understand its place in the cosmos, let's say, but I'm not qualified to answer such questions. I would say, though, that
no one stops listening to a symphony because they know it's going to end. And so I think, in some sense, our proper task is to find the meaning within the finite. When I had clinical clients who were consumed with such questions, because, you can pick a time frame of evaluation that makes all your efforts futile, right? So, well, the sun is going to envelop the earth. I think it's 4 billion years, so get ready. It's like, well, what's the point of stopping this baby from crying when the sun is going to envelop the earth in 4? Well, yeah, you all laugh, right? But that laughter, you see, that's a sign of wisdom. That's preposterous. Why? I mean, that's the existential question, right? It's like, well, if we're all doomed to ashes and decay, why do anything? Well, I used the baby crying for a reason. I mean, who in the world is going to use that argument to not feed their baby? Well, why feed that thing? In 4 billion years, the sun's going to envelop the earth. It's like, wrong time frame, folks. And so what I would say, and I did say to my clinical clients, if you're adopting a time frame that makes what you're doing appear trivial, the problem isn't necessarily what you're doing, although it might be, and you have to ask yourself that question because perhaps you are engaging in something that's more trivial than you should be. The problem is that your mind, which is capable of leaping across evaluative frameworks, has picked a time frame inappropriate for the task. So quit doing that. Instead, you could say, well, why don't you practice adopting the time frame that imbues your properly oriented action with the deepest possible apprehended meaning? And why would you not think that the fact that that meaning manifests itself with the proper choice of time frame, why wouldn't you accept the fact that's indication of a valid choice? It certainly feels like it. You know what it's like. You get engaged in something, a deep conversation, a piece of music, a piece of art, something you love doing, someone you love being with. You get engaged in that. You lose your sense of temporality. And you don't pop out of it and think, oh my God, I wish I would have used a time frame that made everything irrelevant because of my, cognitive brilliance. You think, hey, we could do that some more. Like, how about all the time? And that's a good goal. It's like, yeah, how about that all the time? And then you've got time right when you're engaged like that. And I would say that's a profound neurophysiological signal that you're in the right place at the right time, right? Because it's accompanied by a sense of deep well-being, and that's literally an antidote to suffering. I mean that literally. It's with many of my clients who were suffering, what we would strive to do was not so much make them happy, because sometimes that was impossible. They were so crippled in so many ways, often physically and in pain, but something meaningful. That would keep them going and keep them from straying and keep them from thinking homicidal and genocidal thoughts, all of that. And meaning, that's the antidote to suffering. And the question is, well, how is that best to be found? Well, that's an empirical question. You have to look in your own life and see where meaning glimmers and then pursue that, right? That's what Harry Potter is doing, by the way, when he's chasing the snitch. Just thought I'd let you know. And you win the game if you catch that thing. So, well, that's not exactly right. You get 100 points, but, it'll do. So, another question? How about you?
Hi, thank you very much for the lecture. You talked a lot about meaning, both from perception and in music and art. What do you mean by meaning? What is meaning, and where is its source?
Meaning is implication for action or for reorganization of the perceptual frames that frame action. So there.
And is that the sole aim of what you? Is that what you find in art and music?
Yes, in complex ways. I mean, in music, you find this demand that the music lays upon you to orient yourself in relationship to this harmonious interplay of patterns. And you might say, well, why is that meaningful? Well, that's a good question. Well, it's because you're acting out something like the adaptation of your soul to the structures of reality itself. Now, it's done very abstractly because the patterns of music are not precisely the actual patterns of the world, right? They're abstractions. But it's play and representation, and it's art. And so you're acting out the process of optimal adaptation at a very high level. When you think what people are doing, imagine a Viennese waltz, you know, so you have this unbelievably well-trained orchestra. They're all emitting patterns like mad, and they're playing while they're doing that, putting little twists on the patterns so that they're a little novel, a little interesting, even if you've heard the music many times. You have the conductor who's keeping all these specialized subsections operating in harmony, and then you have the couples dancing, and they're trained to do that, but they're cutting the rug, you know, in the same way. They have their moves, and they're trying to impress each other, and there's a mating aspect of that, and they're all doing that harmoniously, and it's a complete vision of a ordered society, right from the subatomic realm, let's say, all the way up to the cosmic realm. That's all taking place in the dance, and people don't know that, but well, they do know it too, you know, and they know it in that they're acting it out. And there isn't anything, in some sense, that you know more deeply or believe more deeply than that which you act out. And you're not smart enough to understand the full totality of your actions. I mean, we're not transparent to ourselves. We act out all sorts of things that are stunningly brilliant without realizing it. And it takes, in some sense, it takes often untold centuries for us to figure out what we were doing and why. And so that happens to you, you know, in your own life when you have a flash of insight into your own behavior. That's why I was doing that. It's like, well, you were doing it. Why didn't you know? Well, you're complicated. You're really complicated and certainly not transparent to yourself. And so I have a paper called 3 Types of Meaning. You could look that up if you wanted a more technical answer, but the music answer by example is a good one. And I think people can really relate to it because, you know, the only person you ever hear who says, well, I don't really like music is like, no, that's just a posture, you know. You like music. You just want to be, you know, kind of interestingly different and controversial. And it's really something, right? And it's also interesting that music has this non-propositional structure that's completely opaque to rational argumentation. You know, I used to like to watch punk rockers, yeah, especially the ones who did mosh pit punk rock. And, you know, I went to a Ramones concert once. It was quite comical. I was on the 2nd floor. It was so loud. I couldn't hear for 3 days after this concert because it was a pretty little theater. We sat about 800 people, and they had their stadium speakers in there. It was like sonic wall of sound. And we were above this mosh pit, and there was all these like nihilistic punk rockers down there smashing into each other and throwing themselves off the stage. And I thought, for all this talk of nihilism, there you are dancing to the harmonious patterns of life. It's like, you know, smash the state and all of that. It's like, we'll groove to that. Yeah, it's very comical. So even among the most propositionally nihilistic, they still fall in love with music.